I'm going to tell you about STIL and how personal assistance was introduced to Sweden. STIL was established as a result of an international conference held in Stockholm in 1983 on the initiative of Adolf Ratzka. Two frontrunners of the United States independent living movement were invited to the conference, Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts. Other international guests were also invited. The conference focused on the issue of personal assistance. It was the same issue that a commission chose to continue working with after the conference. From this commission, STIL was formed in 1984. The organization's first goal was to work out how personal assistance would work in the real world in Sweden. In the beginning, STIL was composed of about 20 members who all needed personal assistance in different ways and to different degrees. Many of our members had long been dependent on relatives, or they had been dependent on municipal home help services, or they had lived in some form of residential institution. One thing we had in common was that we wanted to break free of our dependency. We wanted to run our own lives. We were tired of someone else always deciding who was going to wipe our asses. We were tired of regulations that stipulated how often we were allowed to take a shower or take a trip downtown. We wanted to take control. That was why we started our experiment in 1987. A project that came to be known as the STIL project. It became permanent within 2 years. Within these 2 years, we demonstrated the tremendous increase in quality of the life that comes with personal assistance. We also succeeded showing that personal assistance wasn't more expensive than the existing systems. The City of Stockholm helped us calculate the costs per hours for their home help services. That figure was the basis for our future funding. This is why it's completely incomprehensible that so much of the debate over recent years has focused on economic issues here in Sweden. Since the beginning, the issue of personal assistance has been questioned and discussed from this perspective. But home help services cost at least the same amount per hour. The big difference is that my personal assistants spend 100% of their time working for me. Home help services loses 50% of the work time or more on transport, training and administration. Personal assistance is a more effective way of using tax revenues. Home help services loses a large part of these revenues along the way. But with personal assistance, 100% of the resources make it directly to the assistance user. We who use STIL's services almost never share personal assistants. My personal assistants are trained to meet my unique needs. They know exactly how I want things done. And so the work is performed significantly more effectively than by home help services or in a nursing home. Our mode of operation at STIL is to have our members take as much responsibility for their personal assistance as possible, taking each person's unique capacity into consideration. Each STIL member is responsible for recruiting, training, supervising their assistants. STIL is responsible for paying salaries and for handling other administrative duties. Within 2 years, we demonstrated that many of our members could start working, since they could bring their personal assistants with them to work. Today, 16% of those who use personal assistance are engaged in gainful employment. An additional 24% have stated that they would be able to work if they had more hours of assistance. Furthermore, many of us were able at last to move away from home. Family members who had to assist us and live on state subsidies up to that point were now able to enter the labor market. Many STIL members were also able to move out of the cluster housing facilities and other expensive residential institutions. We were able to start traveling, and our free time was greatly enriched. Many started having their assistants drive them where they needed to go, and could thereby stop using the miserable transportation service for the disabled. We were finally at least able to try to have social lives more or less like others. In brief, personal assistance gave us a quality of life much greater than when we had experienced earlier. The results of our project were acknowledged by a government commission at the beginning of the 1990s, which proposed that personal assistance be made a lawful right. Please note that this proposal came while Sweden was experiencing a severe bank crisis and interest rates were up around 500%. This demonstrates that you can fight for civil rights even in the middle of an economic recession. Despite the financial crisis, the proposal was passed as a Swedish Personal Assistance Act in 1994. Today, there are 20,000 people in Sweden who use personal assistance. They employ about 80,000 personal assistants. Personal assistance costs about 2 billion euros each year, which is equivalent to half of the Swedish defense budget. But since most of the funding goes towards assistance salaries, over 50% of the costs come back to the state in the form of value-added taxes, employment tax and income tax. STIL is no longer the only operator on the market. Each assistance user can choose between several hundred companies, cooperatives and municipalities that offers personal assistance. They can also handle it completely on their own if they so choose. Each year the government sets the rates for how much a person gets per hour of assistance. For 2011 it was 26 euros. This sum is supposed to cover salaries, training, as well as travel and administrative costs. The Social Insurance Office calculates each person's assistance need in numbers of hours per year. The average assistance user is given 100 hours of assistance per week. To get a perspective on exactly what STIL accomplished, we can think about what our lives would be like if we were still using home help services today. Home help services is an institution, even if there is no actual entranceway with a cast iron gate. Most of what I'm going to tell you here about the Swedish home help services is therefore also true for institutions in general. Please remember that our criticism of home help services and other institutions is not directed at the people who work at those institutions. What we are criticizing are the traditions, attitudes, and approaches of those institutions. When we first started demanding personal assistance, it was because, to a large degree, we were living under house arrest. The home help services barely met our most basic needs. We couldn't even get out of the door unless it was planned several days in advance. It might be hard to believe it now, but we couldn't even get down to the corner pizzeria to buy a pizza. You couldn't just decide to head over to a friend's on the spur of the moment. When the weather was good, you had to be sacrificed with just sitting on your balcony. If you were out of coffee, you just had to wait for the next week's grocery shopping. It was all too easy for the personnel to take advantage of our vulnerable situation, and many didn't hesitate. Since you yourself had no control whatsoever over who worked for you, you tried to use the service as little as possible. The tragedy is that most people who lived in these circumstances adapted to them. Usually, you do anything to survive. You lower your expectation drastically and try to convince yourself that things are fine as they are. After several years of cutbacks, the Swedish home help services resources are at all-time low. It's only a person's most basic needs that they are able to meet. If you get help eating, shitting, pissing, getting clean, and getting up in the morning, then you should consider yourself lucky. You're referred to your family for everything else. If they can't take care of it, you are more or less openly threatened with being moved to an institution. About half of everyone who use home help services today is dependent upon a relative of the same age who take care of them for free. We at STIL were very frustrated over the overriding law that still regulates home help services today. This piece of legislation include no rights whatsoever for the individual. Then, as now, you could be awarded ridiculously low levels of home help services. It all depended on where you lived and your country's financial situation. Sometimes it even depended on what part of the country you lived in. This is what is called municipal autonomy. We demanded statutory rights instead. We could no longer stand being at the mercy of the country's inconsistencies. This is why we were lobbying for the new Personal Assistance Act. Being dependent on home help services was very much like living on a subway platform. New, unknown faces floated past us all the time, and this was going on in our very bedrooms. You would think that our home help services would have learned something from how things have gone with personal assistance. But the quality of home help services have only gotten worse instead. This should teach us an important lesson, which is that most important factor is who is in charge. If we still had home help services today, God forbid, then we would have an even lower quality of the life that we had before personal assistance was introduced. This too can teach us a crucial lesson. You have to demand your rights in society. There is no other way that you will be given your rights. You have to take your rights, and those who don't will be left without them.